Without further introduction, this is the Jim Conca.
That's great. Thank you. I'll be here till Tuesday. Michael Shellenberger has been an environmental and social justice advocate for over 25 years. As co-founder and senior fellow at the Breakthrough Institute and as founder and president of Environmental Progress, Michael is one of the world's leading pro-nuclear environmentalists, which to me is the best kind. His writings have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Scientific American, Nature, Energy, BLAS Biology, and Forbes, where he's a regular science contributor. His TED Talks have been viewed by over 1 million people, and he has served as an advisor to MIT's Future of Nuclear Energy Task Force. Michael is co-author of visionary books and essays, including an Eco-Modernist Manifesto, The Death of Environmentalism, and Breakthrough, which was called Prescient by Time magazine, and the best thing to happen to environmentalism since Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. Please help me welcome Michael Shellenberger.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you all for your excellent work in support of getting the truth out about radiation, about nuclear energy, nuclear medicine. I'm going to present entirely new material today. This is from our forthcoming book on nuclear, and it's called Oppenheimer's Revenge: The Making of a Radiation Panic. Is there any way to dim the lights just a little bit? Will people still be able to see their food if we dim the lights? People will fall over. It'll be like a safety hazard. So I think all of you already know that nuclear is the safest way to make reliable electricity. This is from the most recent peer-reviewed study in Lancet, and it's basically a repetition of every major study on the health impacts of different energy sources. And I put it up here just to remind you of it, and also to underscore, I think, the importance of putting nuclear and radiation in context. And the reason for its safety is that it doesn't produce conventional air pollution, which kills 7 million people a year, which led the climate scientist James Hansen to calculate that nuclear power has actually saved 1.8 million lives. So I think a lot of times those of us that defend nuclear power, or those of us that emphasize that radiation at low doses is either harmless or has very little effect, given the debate here, I think we sometimes get a little bit on the defensive when really what we should be talking about is all the ways in which nuclear saves lives. And yet, at the same time, nuclear is one of the least popular forms of energy. It's just slightly more popular than coal, although coal doesn't operate on the unconscious in the way that I think nuclear power does. This is from a global survey conducted recently. And the reason isn't hard to understand. People think that nuclear is dangerous, not just in the United States or in a few other countries. This is a universal view of nuclear. So why is that? Why is something that's so safe perceived as so dangerous? That's the question I want to explore. Even wind turbines turned out to be quite dangerous. Jim wrote a column about wind deaths. There's actually a large data set of wind deaths that we've verified ourselves. Turns out that people die in all manner, including these 2 maintenance workers who got caught in a fire at the top of the turbine. One of them died by plummeting off of it, and the other one in the fire itself. This is in Denmark in 2013. But that's not the only thing that's going on. We tolerate dangerous things when we think that we need them. And so when people don't think they need nuclear power, support for it declines. There's really no disagreement about this phenomenon among the pollsters. You can see support for nuclear power went from 62% favorable in around 2009, when just before the natural gas revolution, to 44% today. If you don't think you need nuclear, then you don't want to have it. Now, if you were looking for somebody to blame in terms of the problems here, you might blame women, because they support nuclear at such low levels. Now, I'm going to argue as we go that actually you should blame men, but nonetheless you see there's a huge gender gap that social scientists have been trying to understand and explain for over 40 years. Given the sexist way in which male researchers reason, the initial response is, well, that's because the women are uninformed. That turns out not to be true, and in fact, female scientists, just as informed as male scientists, also have lower support for nuclear power. The second hypothesis was that it has to do with the relative disempowerment of women in the society. People that are less powerful are more afraid of things in general. And support for that came from the fact that racial minorities also have lower support for nuclear, and I should say that it's really only African Americans, Latinos support nuclear at about the same level as whites, but the race gap is only 10 points as opposed to 30 points for women. So we want to understand, what is it about nuclear that is behind this gender gap? All of this, I think, has clearly driven the decline of nuclear generation in the real world. Nuclear as a share of electricity globally peaked in the mid-1990s. It peaked as total generation in the mid-2000s. I think finally the nuclear industry and the nuclear scientific community is coming to grips with the fact that the underlying driver of nuclear's decline in the real world is from lack of public support. It's from lack of social license. It's not due to some particular thing about the technology. And as a consequence, one of the things I think you don't hear enough about is that we're at very serious risk of losing 2 times more nuclear power than we might add. We've done our own calculations. We think that the ones done by the nuclear industry, in particular by the World Nuclear Association, are overly rosy scenarios designed to support their corporate members. So where does all this come from? What are the origins of this? Well, over the last 10 years, Edward Calabresi has argued in a series of papers that there was a set of quote-unquote mistakes made in the adoption of LNT. And he suggests that these mistakes aren't so simple, that the mistakes are actually motivated by something. Well, what's motivating them? Well, one of his colleagues, the late Zbigniew Jaworski, wrote an article. We tried to understand it, and he said, "It was the leading physicists responsible for inventing nuclear weapons, having realized how dangerous their inventions were, who instigated the fear of small doses. In their noble, wise, and highly ethical endeavor to stop preparations for atomic war and the hysterical amassment of enormous arsenals of nuclear weapons, they were soon followed by many scientists from other fields. Later on, this developed into opposition against atomic power stations and all things nuclear." I think that Zbigniew gets to an important historical moment, which I want to delve into, but I want to suggest that there's a darker and I think more accurate reading of the campaign against nuclear energy than the one that he suggests is strictly noble, wise, and ethical. So let's take a look at the rise of both the hopes and the fears of radiation. They emerge at the same time, and you see some of the original enthusiasm came from the scientific community. Frederick Soddy, in his famous book, The Interpretation of Radium, writes, "A race which could transmute matter would have little need to earn its bread by the sweat of its brow. Such a race could transform a desert continent, thaw the frozen poles, and make the whole world one smiling golden Garden of Eden." Obviously, a very different view of melting the ice caps back then than I think prevails today. At the same time, Soddy's book inspired H.G. Wells to write the first account of the destructive use of atomic energy in 1913. The book, which is considered one of his poorer works, but nonetheless maybe his most influential, opens with the harnessing of nuclear energy, but quickly results in the use of atomic weaponry. In fact, the first time the words atomic bombs are ever used is in H.G. Wells' book, and he even describes fallout in the context of puffs of luminous radioactive vapor. So what you see is, I think what's important from these two treatments of radiation, one as something that will liberate humankind from drudgery, and the other one that would result in an apocalyptic end of civilization, is just that nuclear energy, radiative energy, is powerful. And when I travel all around the world, I interview people everywhere I go. I ask them what do they think about nuclear energy, taxi drivers, students, my waiters. I'm a very annoying tourist, as you might imagine. I always ask them what they think about nuclear power, and the vast majority say, I don't know anything about it. That's expert arena. And I said, just tell me what you think. And what I hear everywhere is that it's very powerful. And I think that's a very important underlying universal archetype of this technology and of radiation in general. A man named Leo Szilard on the right read H.G. Wells, understood, like many scientists, that there was great positive potential, but also great destructive potential from the advancement of knowledge and science around nuclear. And you can see here recruited Albert Einstein to send his famous letter to President Roosevelt urging the development of an atomic bomb project to counter what he was sure was happening in Germany. That obviously succeeded. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were bombed in 1945, and it sparked a very ambivalent reaction from the scientists that created the atomic bomb. Some of them felt it was necessary. Some of them were literally sick the night of the bombings. Hardly anybody had an unambiguous view of it, and that ambiguity, I think, runs through this technology and through radiation over time. Oppenheimer was not only the father of the bomb, gifted at bringing together all the scientists to build it, but also became sort of the chief philosopher, writing, "The safety of this nation cannot lie wholly or even primarily in its scientific or technical prowess. It can be only based on making future wars impossible." It's a very interesting statement. On the one hand, he's suggesting, and in fact, the night of the Hiroshima bombings told the other Manhattan Project scientists not to worry, because the weapon was so terrible, it would not only never be used again, but it would prevent all future wars. At the same time, he suggested that human consciousness needed to evolve. And this kind of view, is it the technology that's going to protect us, or is it an evolution of human consciousness that will protect us, runs through the discussion of nuclear energy for decades to come. Now, another seminal article was written by George Orwell, just a couple of months after the bombing. Here's the key passage: "Ages in which the dominant weapon is expensive or difficult to make will tend to be ages of despotism, whereas when the dominant weapon is cheap and simple, the common people have a chance. We may not be heading for a general breakdown, but for an epoch as horribly stable as the slave empires of antiquity, a permanent state of Cold War with its neighbors. If the bomb is a rare and costly object as difficult to produce as a battleship, it is likelier to put an end to large-scale wars at the cost of prolonging indefinitely a peace that is no peace." This is the first time that the word Cold War were ever used, and it just struck me recently, and my colleagues, that Cold War is a very funny use of words, because there is no war. You're describing something that's not actually a war, and yet it feel all of the tension and the foreboding and the dread is in it. I think the other thing that we see in this Orwell quote is something that's very important to left-wing people when it's invented and from then on, which is this idea that there is no protection against tyranny anymore. In fact, when I wrote some supportive articles recently in support of the role of nuclear weapons in creating world peace, one of the main arguments I heard from my left-wing friends was it will just lock in tyranny. That's a very old idea, and it goes back to Orwell. Now, that wasn't the end of the story. Oppenheimer was very quick to basically ghostwrite a report called the Acheson-Lilienthal Report. Acheson was the Deputy Secretary of State under Truman. Lilienthal was the head of the Tennessee Valley Authority. And in it, they recommended something that's, I think, remarkable for its radical quality, which is that they suggested turning all of the entire nuclear fuel cycle, including the mines and all nuclear power plants, over to the United Nations. Without world government, there could be no permanent peace, Oppenheimer argued. Nations would need to agree to partial renunciation of nuclear. And Oppenheimer even went so far as to suggest something that turned out to be unscientific, which is the idea that we could denature uranium. So what you see in this is, I think, quite audacious on the one hand. It's the idea that Oppenheimer and his friends would continue to control this new gunpowder. Of course, it would be under the auspices of the United Nations, but it would essentially extend their control. And so, Oppenheimer has there's a biography that came out about, I think, 13 years ago called American Prometheus about Oppenheimer, and I thought to myself, Oppenheimer was really suggesting that he become the anti-Prometheus. He didn't want to deliver this new fire to humankind. He wanted to restrict it. He was acting more like the gods in the Greek mythology than he was like Prometheus. And you also see here a desire for some kind of a technical fix, something that we can just kind of do to the materials or the machine that will stop the new gunpowder from spreading. So this report was greeted with a lot of very polite nods and hmms and very interesting, and instantly rejected by President Truman and most everybody else. That dynamic and that tension, I think, between a pretty radical idea, which is that nations should give up the sovereignty. In other words, if you have a uranium mine, whether you're Congo or Canada or whatever, you don't get to control it anymore. There's nothing like that that's really had been proposed before or since, and at the same time, a wholesale and almost immediate rejection from the powers that be. So this is the high point, I think, of Oppenheimer's powers, or I would say maybe Oppenheimer's powers have started to decline within the institutions of power, but I think also started to expand in the broader society. Oppenheimer starts to become not just a public intellectual, arguably one of the most influential individuals on the planet. By 1949, and I'm sorry, let me back up and say, Oppenheimer at this point and most other Manhattan scientists were very enthusiastic about nuclear power. Oppenheimer went so far as to say that nuclear power was the key to continuing industrial human civilization. It was an unalloyed good. It was really mentioned without any description of any potential hazards. You get 3 years later, Oppenheimer's power is continuing to wane, and the new star, of course, is Admiral Hyman Rickover there on the left. The photo is of shipping port, but really the photo's out of context, so it really should be a photo of the Nautilus. Rickover meets with Oppenheimer and the General Advisory Committee of Scientists to the Atomic Energy Commission, and Rickover is now the emerging star. He's describing his submarine. He brings a little wooden model of the Nautilus. And Oppenheimer, at this point, I think you can't describe it as anything other than sort of sour grapes, starts to push Rickover on the hazards and the unknowns and the uncertainties, and Rickover shoots back, when you were building the bomb, did you solve every uncertainty before you moved forward? And Oppenheimer said, yes, which was total bullshit, of course. They had no idea. You might remember the famous story where Louis Alvarez is trying to deal with, he's having to take a hammer and a chisel to the bomb at one point to get out the pockets of air that have made themselves in there. Richard Rhodes describes sort of harrowingly, here is hammering into the uranium bomb, truly not something that you can model for or predict. At that moment, Oppenheimer's tune changes. Nothing has emerged that suggests some new hazards or some new problem in nuclear power. How could it? We don't have any yet. So he says nuclear power is a dangerous undertaking. Rickover leaves the room. Oppenheimer goes over to that little wooden model of the Nautilus, holds it in his hand and crushes it. So in case you get a sense of, I think, was it just noble, wise humanism on the part of these scientists, or was there a bit of some bitterness, some jealousy, some sour grapes? Of course, Oppenheimer, exceedingly ambitious person, he wanted to be on good terms with the Washington Generals and to be the savior of humanity at the same time, wrote Freeman Dyson. So he remained in his position up until he was finally persecuted and forced out of government by having a security clearance taken away. So 1953, fast forward a bit, Oppenheimer gives a very famous speech to the Council on Foreign Relations that's eventually published in Foreign Affairs. It reflects what he was already arguing to the incoming Eisenhower administration. And he says, most famously, and Eisenhower respects Oppenheimer greatly, as does everybody really still, despite his somewhat kooky ideas of international control. And the most famous passage, of course, is that Oppenheimer says, we are like two scorpions under glass, each one capable of killing the other, but only at a cost to his own life. A classic Oppenheimer, brilliant literary allusion. And then he urges more candor. He urges Eisenhower to level with the American people about just how much destructive power we have and how much destructive power the Soviets have. Never totally clear why Oppenheimer wants this. There's sort of a view that secrecy is sort of bad in and of itself and more transparency is good in and of itself, and this has been viewed by most historians as sort of an alloyed good. I have a bit more of a jaundiced view of it. But Oppenheimer actually goes on to say something I think quite strange given the scorpions metaphor. He says atomic weapons strongly favor the side that attacks aggressively and by surprise. Now, this is a direct contradiction, in my view, of what he had just said. In other words, who cares if the scorpion attacks you by surprise? You're still going to kill it. But he wants to introduce that tension in here, I think, in order to continue to sort of make a case against nuclear's potential deterrent effect that most people believed existed, including Orwell. And in fact, Eisenhower took up Orwell on his suggestion, and he asked his speechwriter to write some initial drafts of his famous Atoms for Peace speech, but they came back incredibly bloody. Everybody dead on both sides with no hope anywhere. Is this all we can do for our children? Eisenhower said to his speechwriters. He then, it was really Eisenhower, according to the historians, that really came up with this idea, really pulling back on this promise from Saudi through Einstein and the early Oppenheimer that nuclear energy would be the way to redeem ourselves. Speaks before the United Nations General Assembly. I always think it looks a bit like a cathedral. Instead of having a cross, you have the garland of the United Nations there, everyone in their pews listening. And Eisenhower gives a brilliant speech describing the horrors and the terribleness of nuclear weapons, but the ways in which we would redeem ourselves with nuclear energy. Now, the problem with the speech in retrospect is that he actually reinforces the idea that the nuclear weapons are weapons of destruction and war and not potentially weapons of deterrence and peace, and leaves that unresolved tension that will then be taken advantage of by Oppenheimer and other anti-nuclear scientists. In fact, as Oppenheimer's isolation grows, he starts to argue increasingly of the danger. Nonetheless, we can all still be captivated by this humanistic vision that Eisenhower offers. Experts would be mobilized to provide abundant electrical energy in the power-starved areas of the world. I think in contrast to what's happened to the industry in the 70 years since, where there's been a big emphasis on how, well, hey, we're just neutral scientists, we're just doing it because it's science and rationality. This was clearly a moral mission, and he spoke with that moral power, what I would call the transcendent moral purpose of nuclear: lift everybody out of poverty, protect the natural environment, and bring peace on Earth. Nonetheless, Oppenheimer's isolation, losing the fight over international control, led him to take some very bizarre positions over the coming years. Oppenheimer, instead of in his argument against the hydrogen bomb, known as the super, argued that instead what we should have are more tactical or battlefield nukes, which is a view that's considered very right-wing today, because what Oppenheimer said is, otherwise we're not going to use them. We should have tactical nukes so we can use them, which runs against the idea that you have these powerful nuclear weapons precisely so you won't use them. The use of nuclear weapons is that they don't get used, or rather they get used for deterrence and peace. The second thing that Oppenheimer later said, and I think this is just of a man that is really starting to lose himself to bitterness, argues that we should actually consider a preemptive war against the Soviet Union, which is sort of a shocking thing to read by somebody who is universally known as a peacemaker and a humanist. This unresolved tension around nuclear weapons creates a vacuum into which all manner of ideas rush, including more of the internationalization of weapons. The most famous is the famous Pugwash Conference, 1955. Albert Einstein and the British philosopher Bertrand Russell published a manifesto. We are speaking on this occasion not as members of this or that nation, contingent, or creed, but as human beings, members of the species man, whose continued existence is in doubt. A war with H-bombs might possibly put an end to the human race. We have found that the men who know most are the most gloomy. The abolition of war will demand distasteful limitations of national sovereignty. So much going on here. The first is that this is, I think, the first sort of manifestation of an environmentalist discourse, the idea that I'm not speaking for myself as a person of Britain or the United States, but as I'm speaking for all of humankind. The other is that nuclear war would be apocalyptic, that there would not be any more human civilization or even a human species, and that we have to sacrifice our national sovereignty, and that really there's no alternative, that deterrence is really not an alternative, that peace through deterrence is not an alternative, because inevitably having these weapons will lead to our extinction. And it's that sort of dogmatism that I think underscores the fears that are shooting through this fear of radiation that's existed ever since. And I would just note that one of the signers to the Pugwash Manifesto was Robert Mueller, the Calabrese's famous fruit fly geneticist. By 1957, as the atomic weapons testing is going on, McCall's, which is the biggest women's magazine in the country, helpfully offers "Radioactivity is poisoning your children" as a banner at the bottom. There's a little bit, you note that we always like to talk about how nature provides the antidote near the poison. You can see there's a little headline right there, "How to Relax in 10 Minutes," which I think you need to read after you read the "Radioactivity is Poisoning Your Children" article. There's a lot of good reasons why women would be more afraid of radiation and nuclear power. Children in utero just are more sensitive to injury, and that includes from radiation. And that, I think those natural fears that women and mothers would have clearly pre-existed science and clearly pre-existed any sort of rational basis for it. So I think this was understood widely that the people that were the most concerned about this, and I think rightly so, were mothers. Another important event, 1957, and this is Oppenheimer by this point has really faded from view. He's checked out, he's not going to be involved in politics much more, but the mantle is taken up by other Manhattan Project scientists, including Ralph Lapp, who does this incredible interview with Mike Wallace. I love this, this is amazing. This is a question from Mike Wallace describing Lapp's views. "Just last week you proposed the establishment of a sperm bank. Now, according to your plan, healthy male sperm would be stored like blood is stored now, so in case of a nuclear war, we'd be able to propagate the human race with healthy sperm rather than with sperm that has been exposed to radiation, sperm which might breed deformed infants." This is a very common theme in the history of radiation and nuclear, is that radiation will create monsters. In fact, you see, if you look at the movies that came out after the atomic weapons, it's just the big ants and the big Godzilla and the monsters, this idea that radiation creates mutations that make something big, it's getting large. And then, of course, the movie resolves the cognitive dissonance that the weapons have created by allowing humans to kill the monster. And you get that satisfaction that you've vanquished it, but of course it's still looming overhead. And I think the other issue, of course, we see here is this issue of the genetics, which is about the future, about our offspring. You may not have apocalypse, but we may end up, if we don't protect our sperm somehow, with a race of subhuman monsters. This starts with Frankenstein, goes all the way through the nuclear history. Lapp says, let me point out that the difference between relative and absolute numbers, for example, if I say the risk of inducing leukemia in a population is 1/100th of 1%, that may seem relatively small, but if we multiply 1/100th of 1% by a total population of 2,800,000,000, you see we have a very large number of people. Does that sound familiar to anybody in this room? You know, I think what's interesting about it, too, is that you get a sense of these risks as overlapping. This is low probability, high consequence risks, not just the nuclear war, but also the chance that you might get leukemia from radiation. So it's a bit of it's the terror of being in a lottery and not knowing if your number's been called. Mike Wallace, suppose conceivably science could invent an instrument, a source of fantastic energy that would be a great good to mankind, but that also might enable the scientists literally to destroy the entire world with the push of a button. As a scientist, would you help invent that force? Lapp, I would not. I think this is a case where we are finding that scientists are becoming more and more socially conscious. A very bizarre exchange on the one hand, because it seems like they're talking about a technology that doesn't exist, when of course what they are talking about is a technology that everybody does think exists. More to the point, I think this is also then is perfect prelude into the environmental anti-nuclear movement which will emerge, which is this idea that the price of abundant clean energy is too high for the risks. That's what's being said here, and that the ethical thing is to accept scarce, dirtier, less prosperity and less progress in exchange for the continuation of the human race. So now let's turn to the use of this radiation panic by the conservation movement, which transforms itself into the environmental movement. In 1962, David Brower, the head of the Sierra Club, told one of his young colleagues, David Pessinen, to go check out a proposed nuclear plant that Pacific Gas and Electric wanted to build in Northern California. Pessinen went up there. He came back and he said, it was a turning point in my life. I had a feeling of the enormousness of what we were fighting. It was anti-life. I began to see it as the ultimate brutality short of nuclear weapons. We are now getting into what psychologists would call displacement. We're getting close to where nuclear energy becomes something like something maybe a little bit less of diluted form of weapons. Pessinen came back, he told the Sierra Club, he said, I know how to defeat this nuclear plant. It's not going to be by talking about the scenic values. We have to frighten people about the potential of radioactive fallout. And the Sierra Club Board of Directors was horrified by this idea. Don't you dare raise these safety concerns. That's not who we are. We're a conservation club. We're not about frightening people or engaging in that sort of science. Pessinen left the organization, quickly found as his main two allies a couple of very fierce women, Hazel Mitchell, to stop the Bodega Head Project, and Doris Sloan. They made 1,500 helium balloons that they attached little notes to that they let go from the proposed nuclear site that read, this could be strontium-90 and fall out near you. The balloons were used to terrify the public and, importantly, to scare the local dairy farmers who contributed to Pessinen's campaign. They succeeded and ended up killing the plant, which then relocated down south. If you're trying to get people aroused about what's going on, use the most emotional issue you can find. Is this wise, noble, highly ethical pursuit? Everybody thought they were doing the right thing, but you can say that about everybody. You could say that about Saddam Hussein or Al-Qaeda. Everybody thinks they're doing the right thing, but it's hard to read this Machiavellian approach to attacking radiation and nuclear as wise, ethical, and purely with good intentions. These guys had their knives out very early. I didn't really care about nuclear accidents, said one anti-nuclear leader, because there's too many people anyway. I think that plain dirty, if you have a noble end, is fine. Martin Litton, also the Sierra Club. Well, where does it go from here? I mentioned before displacement. It's a very simple psychological concept to understand. Your boss shouts at you at work, you shout at your spouse at home. That's what displacement is. Spencer Wirt, who wrote The Best History of the Rise of Nuclear Fear, concludes all the elements of classic displacement were indeed present. Persistent anxiety about nuclear war. There was only an inability to dispel the anxiety in the only genuine way by getting rid of the bombs. Finally, there was a target toward which frustrated feelings could redirect themselves, and all the more easily because of the many associations between bombs and reactors. Can't get rid of the weapons, maybe I can stop my local nuclear plant from being built. Will that provide some satisfaction to you? Probably. Doesn't get rid of the anxiety, which then later displaces itself onto global warming, but it does provide a sense of power and control. You felt like you were contributing to a more peaceful world. You had some big transcendent moral purpose yourself as a local anti-nuclear energy activist, in contrast to the seemingly impossible task of getting rid of missiles pointed at each other around the world. There's something else going on, though. This is no singular phenomenon. If this were so simple, then it wouldn't be so persistent or so powerful. And so what we have going on at the same time is this awareness that nuclear power means that humankind will never run out of resources. We have infinite energy. Infinite energy means infinite fresh water, infinite fertilizer, infinite food. There is no more need for scarcity. We are now in a post-scarcity society. Everybody knew it. This was widely discussed in the early 60s, and it was embraced by many conservationists who had what we might call an eco-modernist vision, including the head of the Sierra Club. Cheap energy in unlimited quantities is one of the chief factors allowing a large, rapidly growing population to set aside wildlands, open space, and lands of high scenic value. Even our capacity and leisure to enjoy this luxury is linked to the existence of cheap energy. I read this after 30 years of taking me to get to the same conclusion. It was kind of like, wow, wish I had found Will Seary, 1966, and you can see the angel of Frederick Soddy hovering there near him. Old idea, but now it's about protecting the natural environment, not just about material abundance for humankind. This was the argument within the club. If a doubling of the state's population in the next 20 years is encouraged by providing the power resources for this growth, California's scenic character will be destroyed. We're not going to just concentrate in the cities. There's going to be all sorts of people everywhere. So the nightmare of suburbs, of too many people on my hiking trails, too many people on the roads. This was the nightmare that they worried about, and in fact, the establishment in California, the anti-nuclear establishment in California, has basically followed through on the Brower vision, not the Seary vision. which is why our roads are clogged and you can't get anywhere affordable to live. What connection could there possibly be between nuclear weapons and concerns around population? It's everywhere. 1960, cover of Time magazine. It's a racist cover of Time magazine. Sure, there's some white people on that cover, but it's mostly black and brown women. It's the population explosion. As if to underscore the point, in 1969, the head of the Sierra Club publishes Paul Ehrlich's book, The Population Bomb. It's all out of control. The world's at the cusp of apocalypse. There's too many people. There's bombs pointing at each other. It's enough to make somebody go slightly mad. All of this ties itself together with the underlying problem of human hubris, overconsumption. It's to be a little short of disastrous for us to discover a source of cheap, clean, abundant energy because of what we would do with it. Notice the twist on Lapp's view. Lapp said it wouldn't be worth the price because it comes with the potential for apocalypse from nuclear weapons. Lovins is saying it's bad in and of itself to have all that energy. Humankind is going to run over the earth like a cancer. Giving society cheap, abundant energy, the equivalent of giving an idiot child a machine gun. Now the misanthropy is out flamboyantly, happy to be brazenly anti-humanistic. A huge seeming shift from Oppenheimer, though you can still see echoes of that darkness here. All of this drawing on this idea that there's sort of something wrong with viewing the world as resources for our disposal. This comes from the most important philosophical essay against technology by Martin Heidegger. Modern technology puts to nature the unreasonable demand that it supply energy which can be extracted and stored as such. Air is now set upon to yield nitrogen, the earth to yield ore to yield uranium, to yield atomic energy. The problem with humans for Heidegger is that we viewed nature not as this awesome, mysterious, unfolding being outside of our hands, but really as something that we could control. A pretty familiar attack on human ambition, that from Icarus to Prometheus through Heidegger. And now, all of these things, of course, it's not good enough if you think you need nuclear power for the environment or for the economy or for national security, then you've got something there as a ballast against this fear-mongering. So they had to take that away. That's why where renewables come in. A largely wholly solar economy constructed in the US with straightforward soft technologies, now demonstrated, now economic or nearly economic. Apparently that existed in 1976. Who knows why it's still only 2% of our electricity. All of the solar energies that can replace fossil fuels are in hand. Some are already economically competitive. Same idea. It's all already right here. You know, heaven on earth, it's imminent. It's not distant. It's at hand is the idea. It's on the shelf, they would say. Now, I don't want to present a simplistic narrative here. You've already seen how the Malthusianism has complicated and contributed and accelerated the rise of this panic. But there's anomalies like there is in anything. And I think one of the most interesting anomalies is this guy, John Goffman. The difference between us, the scientists raising the alarm about radiation, and the Atomic Energy Commission, AEC, is that we are not willing to play Russian roulette with human lives. Relaxing radiation standards will result in a 30% increase in cancer, he claimed. There's no morality and not even a shred of honesty in any of them. This is legalized murder. The only question is how many murders. Devastating attack from within the Department of Energy system. As devastating, you see Lapp's ghost hangs here. This Goffman and his colleague Tamplin, who was eventually hired by the Natural Resources Defense Council, were everywhere, television, newspapers for years. I believe Goffman is the one that came up to my friend Paul Lorenzini and told him that he killed babies. I mean, these guys were unhinged and powerful. And the only what makes him so anonymous and weird in my story, I was a little disappointed when I found him. I was like, my story's not as neat as I thought, is that Goffman is pro-nuclear weapons. Some people are just radiophobic. I don't know. Wanted underground testing rather than above ground testing, and spent much of the rest of his career warning about X-rays. Before he died, he was giving talks to very small handfuls of mostly women in Marin, which is one of the wealthiest counties in California, talking to them about the dangers of X-rays and mammograms and all that. Nonetheless, the vast majority of folks understood that fear would be a weapon against this horribly abundant source of energy. Our campaign stressing the hazards of nuclear power will supply a rationale for increasing regulation, add to the cost of the industry. I'm in an ongoing competition with Rod Adams about who has the best conspiracy theory. I think I have the smoking gun with this memo. So eat your heart out, Rod, if you're here. There you go. Nuclear accident could wipe out Cleveland and the survivors will envy the dead. The gloves were off. There was just no difference at this point between nuclear weapons and nuclear meltdowns. I've come to think now that nuclear meltdowns were a kind of little explosion. And the nuclear waste, which I think is the best kind, I think clear objectively is the best kind of waste from energy production, totally self-contained, totally internalized into the economics of a plant, is like a little bomb. I was with the LA Times editorial board, and the editorial board writer was saying to me, she was like, well, we're worried about the waste at the San Onofre. And I was like, well, what are you worried about? She goes, I don't know, a terrorist could use it as a bomb? I was like, I don't know. Are you like a professional journalist? I mean, what other thing can you say, I don't know, it could be used as a bomb? You can't understand this at the rational level. And it's not going to be solved at the rational level either. 1 million people die in the northern hemisphere because of plutonium from atmospheric weapons testing. It's everywhere. What about the waste? You don't want to solve it, said PBS to Ralph Nader. No, because it'll just prolong the industry. Noble, wise, ethically motivated? There it is, harmless. On every level of human thought, radioactive wastes were seen as filthy insults against the proper order of things. It's disgust, it's deep emotions. Why is something so clean viewed as so dirty? The anthropologist says they're using nature in a primitive way. Impurities in the physical world are directly traced to immoral forms of economic and political power. It's unnecessarily dangerous, therefore it's immoral, therefore it's dirty. That's how the logic works. It doesn't, I think people think of it going the opposite way. Those of us that are trapped in our rationalism imagine that people really think it's dirty, and we miss the fact that there's 2 cognitive steps, mostly unconscious, that preceded it. I know it's 1 o'clock. How much trouble am I in, Jim? Okay. Quick, though. Needless to say, everybody already knew that coal was killing, but the death more familiar. And women just continue to be incredible figures here in the anti-nuclear movement with no counterpart in the pro-nuclear movement. China Syndrome, in the middle of this movie, it shows empowered women protesting nuclear power plants at the exact same time that Ralph Nader was organizing women around the country. I mean, look what the nuclear industry was up against. I mean, it's kind of amazing there's even nuclear plants around anymore. Helen Caldicott, New York Times with its sort of highbrow headline in the upper left, Helen Caldicott's Many Lives, Pediatrician Mother Activist, the more lowbrow Wire Service headline, Pediatrician believes babies more susceptible to radiation. I think what matters here is that Helen Caldicott isn't just a doctor. She's not just viewed as an expert by the Times, which they make very clear. She's a woman of action. She's putting her knowledge to work to care for the world in the same way that Oppenheimer or Lapp or Jane Fonda is. You might disagree with them, but at least they're out there in the world trying to do something. There was no counterweight on the side of nuclear that showed that. Instead, what there was a lot of men telling women that they were being too emotional. In fact, I hear it all the time still. They're just so emotional. Is it that the problem, or is it that the nuclear industry and radiation scientists aren't emotional enough? Nobody cares how much you know until they know how much you care. Stephen Covey. We can't remain in our laboratories or hospitals anymore. I'm learning to teach people through love, not hate. What I do now is appeal to their goodness. They've got children, they've got bodies. I try to appeal to their emotions. Have the people who built these weapons ever seen a child die of leukemia? I have. Weapons? I thought it was an anti-nuclear power protest. When I was a child and I saw this on the wall of my father's co-op, I thought that it was a protest against nuclear weapons. It's a protest against nuclear power plants. Needless to say, what got built instead were coal-fired power plants. My colleague Madison Serwinski has created detailed timelines of every nuclear power plant built or killed in the United States to trace the moral panic that it was, which brought down the nuclear power industry. Over 150% more nuclear was killed or canceled than ultimately built. And you can see that this echoes around the world after Chernobyl, in Germany, in the form of Divolka and in South Korea in 2016, known as Pandora. Meanwhile, renewables harmonize with the natural world. So do nuclear plants, by the way. That's Diablo Canyon, the most beautiful nuclear plant in the world. But that's not how the nuclear industry portrays itself. It portrays nuclear energy as a bomb, as something dead and sterile and free from human beings who just get in the way of our rationality with their emotions. That's a control room. Apparently, you don't need people to operate it. Here's a recent piece of propaganda from the Nuclear Energy Institute where really, literally, nuclear is portrayed as industrializing a dehumanized landscape. Well, good. Apparently, they got rid of all the human beings. I guess that's what nuclear weapons were good for. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, the nuclear industry behaved admirably, raising the capacity factors of its nuclear plants, keeping its head down, but again, failing to engage with the public on everything that matters. Lots of talk about how some technical fix will make nuclear cheaper and everybody will love it. The truth of the matter is the safest nuclear plants we have are the ones that we have the most experience operating, and they also tend to be the ones that are the cheapest. We get better at things when we do more of them. That's also why our weapons arsenals are safer and more secure than they've ever been. I better just keep going. I'll end by saying that we're not going to get the world rid of danger, and we're not going to persuade people that radiation and nuclear aren't dangerous. That's a fool's errand, and it's a lie. Everything is dangerous. This podium is dangerous. People die falling. Let's stop trying to tell people that everything's safe. People are comfortable with dangers. We use them all the time. And people are comfortable with nuclear being powerful. When Sting changed his mind on nuclear, what did he say? He said the same thing everybody says. It's a big problem. It's going to require a really powerful energy source. We use the polio virus. We inject it in people's brains. It's very dangerous, the polio virus. We love it, the polio virus. Dangerous things are powerful things, and we need powerful things to save the world. We also know that nuclear is the best for the environment, least amount of materials, the least amount of toxic waste of all the articles I've written. And by the way, I don't know, solar panel waste, is it one of my big concerns? I'm more concerned about the floating islands of plastic in the ocean, but nonetheless, I really rattle the pro-nuclear, the pro-solar, anti-nuclear people when I point out that their toxic solar waste never becomes less toxic, and it all goes to landfills where it's at risk of contaminating the natural environment. They really don't like that part of the story. Radiation is very simple. We expose ourselves to it all the time because it's warm, and we like we need vitamin D. We wear some protection for it. We don't need to educate people about millisieverts or millirems or curies or grays, whatever the heck those are. Nuclear weapons, fine, you don't like them. I might think that they brought deterrence and peace. The record's pretty clear, though. Deaths from wars and battles increased precipitously from 1400 to 1945, and then they plummeted. My friends say, well, that's because of the United Nations or trade or something, something, something. Fine, but those battle deaths declined dramatically as nuclear weapons spread from one country to 9. So just get your big boy pants on, grow up. The world's full of dangerous things. We get better at managing them, and we've all ended up much safer as a consequence. So I'll end by just saying the antidote lies near the poison. Just as women have been mobilized against radiation and nuclear, they can also become the saviors of it, as Mothers for Nuclear shows. Look, they actually work in control rooms, which need people. When you lay out this case, as I did recently, we took people from 40% support of nuclear to 70% in a single sitting. Clearly it works. The same trick was used in South Korea. What's the trick? The scientist gets up and talks about how he's a human being. He's a father. He cares about South Korea. He's got children. Yes, the facts are there in the middle, but he first is a human being, talking about why he cares about this. You're not going to win this argument on radiation by convincing everybody that you're the smartest and you have all the right data. It's just not going to work like that. So I'll end by just saying fear-mongering has always been ideological motivated. It remains that way. It was started by ideological left-wing scientists who resented their loss of power to the military and the industry. The demonization of weapons preceded the demonization of energy. The scientists had the power because of allegedly humanistic motives and their scientific credibility, aided eventually by the Malthusians. Pro-nuclear forces reinforced the interpretation of themselves as more concerned about machines than people. Robotic, soulless, and emotionless Vulcans, insensitive men, and egghead scientists oblivious to human concerns. So what's the way out for you guys? Be like Spock in Star Trek 4? It's the best one, right? He's dying of radiation right now, by the way. Emphasize why you care. Emphasize why we need nuclear. Humanize and familiarize people with radiation. Foreground caring women and mothers as advocates, and call out the hidden ideological agendas and fear-mongering. Thank you very much.